Morning. We are on Kuf Zayin with Aleph 107a. We are in the middle of the laws of Kiddush and Havdalah. And we discussed the question of whether or not one may break mid-meal in order to make Kiddush or Havdalah, or does one have to wait? Let's say for Havdalah, does one have to wait till the next day and make Kiddush prior to a meal rather than mid-meal? Right? We had two different opinions, and we had learned already in the Shulchan Aruch that the law is the moment the person remembers they're supposed to make Havdalah, they do so even if they're in the middle of a meal. But the Gemara had this discussion as to whether or not it's disrespectful to the Kiddush or the Havdalah to be doing so middle of a meal, rather starting the meal off that way. Right? That's where we were.
What about if you didn't forget? You consciously
right, that was the
before, and then you want to keep going into 1 a.m., 2 a.m. You want to keep the Shabbat.
When did you start your meal?
Before, an hour.
So we learned in the Shulchan Aruch that if a person started the meal before Shkia, then he can extend the Shabbos that way. Once Shkia hits, he may not start his meal until he does Havdalah. If he does, he violated that rule, even though he wasn't supposed to. The moment it's the obligation for Havdalah, he's supposed to stop his meal and make Havdalah. But the Gemara was disputing that, or the Gemara was pointing to different opinions. There's some opinions that say that if you began a meal when you weren't supposed to on Saturday night, then you have to wait till the next morning to make Havdalah, because it's disrespectful to Havdalah to be doing it in the middle of a meal. You have to do it at the beginning of a meal, before a meal. So in that opinion, you have to wait till the next morning. But we learned in Halacha that
but it's a meal attached to Havdalah?
Not necessarily. No, that's the funny thing. That's right. When it comes to Kiddush, the meal is attached to Kiddush.
Right.
And there too, we learned that you can, in the middle of your meal, cover your bread, make Kiddush, and then continue your meal. But Havdalah, which is not attached to your meal, but nonetheless, it seems that, at least according to that opinion, it's disrespectful to the Havdalah to be doing it mid-meal, and it should be done the next day before.
So
it
in
seems
that
like
case, you would just finish your meal. And
you have to stop your meal then, because you're not allowed to eat.
Oh, you have to stop your meal.
Bench, wait till the next morning, and then do Havdalah. That's in that opinion. Again, that's right. In this opinion, you make Havdalah in the middle of the meal. In the halachic opinion and the other opinion mentioned in the Gemara, we would make.
And then continue.
That's right. And we discussed the covering of the bread and whether the bracha of hagafen extends to the wine in your meal, whether it's present. The different opinions. We went through all that. Okay, so now the Gemara gets into the discussion of chamar medina. We briefly touched upon it when we learned the Shulchan Aruch in one of our discussions. This idea of using beverages that are of a unique status in that region and using them for Havdalah or Kiddush, and whether one may or may not do so. Or strictly does one have to use wine. Right? We touched upon it briefly when we discussed it once in the Shulchan Aruch, that a person halachically is required to use wine, not available, and certainly with Havdalah, one may use the kind of beverage that's literally the language of the Gemara is chamar medina, which means like the wine of the region, meaning it isn't actually wine, but people in that region treat it like wine because it's such a
it has some status.
It has a status. Yeah, I mentioned this a few times that the best way I think of, we'll see from the Gemara as it discusses, we'll get a better understanding of what
you would serve someone,
what might be qualified. But I think a good way of thinking about it is: would you invite someone to your house for that drink, or someone of repute, not just a buddy? If you're inviting like a guest of some respect, and there's a certain formality to that invitation, would you invite them for that drink exclusively? So a whiskey, the answer would be yes. Even a beer might be yes. A coffee, perhaps, a little bit less, maybe depending on what kind of person. But an orange juice, no.
Soda.
It's right. You're not inviting someone of a significant invitation and say, hey, let's have a Coke. A coffee, a beer. So even a beer is like on the border. But if it's a nice beer and you set it with some fruits and things, you might have someone over for a beer. But a whiskey, certainly, right? So that I think would be a way of imagining it. But let's see how the Gemara does it.
It's also cultural.
That's correct.
That's why it's called.
That's why it's called chamar medina, the wine of the region. The Gemara is going to.
Beer is a big thing.
The Gemara is going to discuss that. The Gemara is going to say that, and you'll see in a second why I come with this, where I think this idea comes from of, would you invite a guest over for that drink?
So, for example, here now they make all these little breweries make these like random beers and all that, and they do one, let's say, for example, with maple syrup.
Craft beer.
Yeah, so a maple syrup one would be like of the region, you know?
It's local,
Yeah.
but do we treat it in a higher status because it's made as a
Well,
craft
it's more
beer?
rare, it's more
I
special.
suppose a craft, like, so okay, let's just take that for example.
That's a low niche.
I'm not sure you would invite someone over to have and just serve them a Heineken. But if you had a
Right,
unique
but if you
Montreal
have-
craft beer that costed
yeah.
a few dollars, you can invite someone over and say, "Hey, I want you to try this new beer that I found, and there's only 100 of them, and they only made 100 bottles or whatever." So you have to like parse between even the subtle things. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch discusses the details, and perhaps we'll get to that. So let's read from the Gemara. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 lines from the top of the page. The line begins with the word "V'hoilach kol hayom kulei," and then in the middle it says "Amrilei." Amrilei Mar Yenuka Mar Kashisha, Bereid Rav Chizda Rav Ashi. Rav Chizda's two sons, Master Yenuka and Master Kashisha. I don't know if Yenuka and Kashisha are their actual names because Yenuka means the young one and Kashisha means the old one. So it could be just mean the younger son of Rav Chizda and the older son of Rav Chizda. Just pointing that out. Or maybe it's actually their names. I have a feeling these are honorifics. Like the younger son and the older son of Rav Chizda. They refer to as master. Yeah, let's see if there's anything on the side here. Yeah, the Gemara on the side it sends us to a Tosfos elsewhere. I'm wondering. I'm sure you talked about it there. At any rate, two sons of Rav Chizda tell Rav Ashi, who's the next generation. Right, so they're talking about the older generation of Chizda, who's one of the leading scholars of the previous generation, and they say, or they're talking about what happened earlier. They say, Zimna Chada, one time, Ikla Meimar La Asrin. A Meimar came to our place, came to our town, came to where we were living. Right? So now we have two scholars involved in the story, Rav Chizda and a Meimar. So, we didn't have any wine. Yeah. And it was Saturday night, and it's time to make Havdalah. We have no wine. So we brought him beer. And he wouldn't make Havdalah. And I'm not sure you pronounce this, but I think it's Ubas Tfas. I'm not sure you pronounce it, but essentially, as Rashbam explains it, he fasted the whole night because you're not allowed to eat before makes Havdalah. And he wouldn't make Havdalah on the beer. So he spent the night without eating. Now Rashbam adds, I'm assuming from elsewhere, that he spent the night reading the book of Daniel. It's just a curiosity as to why it's relevant to the story that he was reading Daniel. The Gemara doesn't make mention of it, but Rashbam decides to. I'm not sure why. He cites to elsewhere in the Gemara. Does Rashi say anything? Rashi doesn't say anything, but Rashbam said that he was reading Daniel. Where's that Vav? Anyway, he spent the night in fasting, not eating because he wouldn't eat before Havdalah, and there's no wine.
Yeah, it's interesting when you try to figure out everything like that example.
But Rashbam put it in there. The question is why Rashbam felt the need to put it here. It's not relevant to the story or the halacha that the Gemara is going to be teaching us. But Rashbam decided to tell us, "V'kara hu b'Daniel." Decided to be Daniel. I don't know why the Rashbam decided to add it to the story. The Gemara doesn't make mention of it, but Rashbam decided in his commentary to put that in. I'm assuming he took it from somewhere else, somewhere elsewhere. There's a little like asterisk telling us to look somewhere, and I can't find where his citation is. But it's not in Masayos Shas. There's a little vav there. It's not in. Can't see where that vav goes. I thought it was supposed to be goes a bach, but I don't see it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, by the way, in looking for this little citation, I see on the side here, on the side of this print of the Gemara, they cite to Rashi elsewhere, where Rashi comments on the same elements. So there, Rashi says that Rav Chizda had two sons, both of which were the same name, and therefore they called the older one Kshisha and the younger one Yenuka, because Kashish means older, Yenuka means younger, so I was right.
Sounds like the same
But apparently they're the same name, which is itself interesting.
Isn't it like Rabbi Gamliel had some that's the name?
I don't know, remember? And they also tell us to look at the Taisvis there, so I'm sure there's a discussion about these names. We can look it up elsewhere. All right, so back to the story. Bottom line, they brought a Maimar wine. They brought him beer. He wouldn't make Havdalah. He spent the night not eating anything, and apparently reading the book of Daniel. Now, Lamacha the next day, Tarchina, we worked very hard. We brought him wine. And Va'avdil, he made Havdalah, V'toyim Midian, he ate something. Now, Lashana, the next year, to Ikla Asin, he came back again. So it seems like this is a yearly visit. Ravashi, I suppose, one of the leading scholar of the day, traveling to visit the various different communities in Babylonia. Now, Loy Havalon Chamra, again, we had no wine. Didn't remember from the year before. The story is very strange, but I'm just going to put it out to read the whole story. I'll tell you my anyway. Aisine Shikra. Again, we had no wine. Again, we brought him beer. Amar, this time he said, Ihachi, if so, that 2 years in a row you're bringing me wine. Chamar Medinahu, I'm sorry, 2 years in a row you're bringing me beer. Chamar Medinahu, this must be the wine of the region.
Yeah. Where it comes from.
And therefore, Abdil B'toyim Midi, I'll make Havdalah and eat something. So Rabbi explains it. There's no wine, there is no other wine in the city. If 2 years in a row you can't find me wine, so clearly wine is not accessible to you.
This is your wine.
Exactly. This is your wine is beer. So there's a few things here that you can derive from this, but which when we go to the Shulchan Aruch, we'll see. First of all, it's only because, as Rambam says it, there's no other wine. If there was wine, go get the wine. Because clearly it's difficult for them to get wine. The first year they had no wine, and the Gemara says the next day, Tarchina, we worked hard to find wine. The next day, because he didn't want to make Havdalah and beer. Now they obviously remembered what happened last year, which means if they could have, they would have brought wine to him. If again they still didn't give him wine, that's what made him realize, okay, it's obviously very difficult for them to get wine, or they have no wine in this place at all. And therefore, this is their standard, which means their standard of using beer is not simply because we like beer, but because wine is difficult to get, if at all.
Different standard.
Correct. So it's not like a choose between wine and beer. Not necessarily. It's the kind of place where it's difficult to access wine, or we have no wine.
Well,
And
in
we treat
today's
beer.
world also, you might be somewhere out of town where you can't get a kosher bottle of wine.
That's right. That's exactly right.
You
want
exactly right.
kosher grape juice.
That's right. But even there, okay, maybe, because even in that case, let's say you're at a place where you can't get kosher wine, but it doesn't mean that culturally speaking, they treat beer as wine. Culturally speaking, they treat wine as wine. I just don't have kosher wine.
No.
So I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that you're probably right, actually.
No, I'm saying who's the culture? Are you talking about the people of like the land or the Jews
The people
who live there?
Okay, good point. Yeah. Also good point. Also good point. Yeah. Also good point.
I would go, let's say you're going on Chabad there somewhere, and he's doing a Kiddush on whatever they have. Like sometimes
Right.
you can't. Some areas. We were in Cambridge for
Yeah, certainly.
Shabbat
Happens all the time.
not a long time ago, and you would think it's like they
Okay.
don't even know what a Jew is.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Anyway, so here's talking about here's talking about Havdalah, but Kiddush is different. But now, so right, so we're getting an idea of what this means, the leniency of using beer. So another element here is that's why I'm using the idea of a guest. They're not embarrassed to serve him the beer, even though last year they didn't want to make Havdalah and beer.
So I have a
Because
question.
that's the way we treat people here. Right? That's the specialty of the drink. That's what it seemed like.
So I have a question. Like you said, they're not embarrassed to serve
Him again, beer, yeah.
because they know that, let's say that's the choice. But how is, like, God forbid, I'm not saying anything, but how is the person who goes to a place like that is not, like, you're putting people on the spot and you're kind of shaming them when you say, like, no, I can't, I'm not doing it on this.
So that's my
or I
question on the
can't do it
story.
on this.
That's my big question on the story. Why didn't you the first time ask them?
What is this?
What's the story with wine? And they would have told him, look, in our region, it's very difficult to get wine and we barely have it. Why didn't he ask them the first time? Unless this in and of itself was part of what he wanted to do. He wanted to teach them that wine is the highest priority. And if a year later you still can't give it to me, now I appreciate that
makes
that wine is not available here, and so I'm taking beer. So that, in other words, he's like intentionally going through this exercise so that they learn it, record it, and put it into the Gemara kind of thing. That's what I have to conclude. Exactly, set precedent. Yeah. How far a person, in other words, on the one hand, the story tells you, hey, you can use beer if you need to. On the other hand, the same story is also telling you how much effort you should put to get wine. So much so that the first year you wouldn't do it because you want to show them you got to exert yourself to get wine, expecting that by the time they come back the next year, they would have prepared themselves. And they still didn't. Now he says, okay, obviously wine is difficult for you to get, so I'm going to do beer. So on the one hand, he's lenient on the beer, but on the other hand, he's also telling you how strict you have to be about getting wine.
Interesting. What did they do for Kiddush?
That's a very good question. What did you do for Kiddush?
And the question following that is, can you gauge what you do for Havdalah based on what you can do for Kiddush?
Very good question, because the Gemara now in a moment is going to compare the Kiddush and Havdalah. Right now it's talking about Havdalah, but this is a good question. Presumably spending Shabbos with them.
Yeah.
Which means he must have made Kiddush. So which means, let's say, they work very difficulty to get wine, but they just don't have enough for more than 2 cups. So they make it for Friday night and Shabbos day, and that's it. So in his expectation, look, you had wine over Kiddush. Let's make Havdalah on wine too. But then the next year, same story. He's like, okay, obviously it's very difficult. You work very hard to get your wine for Kiddush. So which would add to this, to what we're suggesting here. That on the one hand, he's waiting for wine. On the other hand, he's saying, look, if it's that difficult, you're right, because the story begins with Havdalah, even though obviously he spent Shabbos there. Good point. Okay, let's continue to see again. This is all open tabs, so to speak.
Yeah.
And when we get to the Shulchan Aruch, we'll get a better idea.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So says the Gemara, Shmamina, I guess this is the 2 children of Rav Chizda now saying, Shmamina, we derived from this episode. Plus, we learned 3 things from this episode. First of all, Shmamina, we derived from here, Hamavdil, the tefillah, one who makes Havdalah while during his ma'ariv, his tefillah, his prayer. So he's required to make Havdalah again over a cup of wine, right? Because obviously, a Meimar who was there, who's the guest. I said it was Rashi, I'm sorry. They're telling Rav Ashi the story. A Meimar, who was the guest, obviously had done Arvit. He did Havdalah in his Ma'ariv, and yet wanted to make Havdalah on the cup of wine. That's the first thing we learned. We had already learned that from other episodes, but the Gemara is now putting it in as a precedent that this was actually implemented. Shmamina, we also derived from here. It's forbidden for a person to eat before he makes Havdalah. And here we derive, as we learned in the Shulchan Aruch, that the prohibition against eating before a person makes Havdalah is even if you already did Havdalah in your Ma'ariv. So even though you said you did Havdalah in your Ma'ariv, in your Tefillah, you still may not eat until you make Havdalah on cup, which is what he did. He wouldn't eat anything until he made Havdalah the next morning. Number 2. Shema Minah, we also derive from here. Shabbos. One who doesn't make Havdalah on Saturday night, can make Havdalah throughout the week, even though in the story it was the next morning, that at least we learned it's not stuck to that night. You can go till the next day. Now, interestingly, they don't mention in this list of 3 things they learned anything about which drink you have, wine or beer, which we just like parse the story apart and try to derive from here, which again points to the ambiguity of this permissibility to use Havdalah, to use beer for Havdalah. They didn't just say, oh, you're allowed to use Havdalah for beer. No, you're not. Look, 1 year he didn't do it. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not such a clear cut.
Seems from the story that it's very, very last.
Exactly. Which is why they didn't put it on the list. The other things are clear cut. He would not eat until he make Havdalah. He made sure to make Havdalah even though he did it in Arvit. Right? He did it the next morning without a problem. Right? So those are clear. But the other things is more ambiguous because 1 year he didn't do it. The next year he said, okay, you know what? I could do it. So they wouldn't put that in as a derivative because it's not like a clear cut, oh yeah, you have license to use beer. Or you can never use beer. Neither of those are true. It's narrow, it's subtle, and it's circumstantial.
Yeah.
So which again would support this notion that we're suggesting here that's not so clear, given the fact that they don't list it on the things that they derive from the story, which you would think is the obvious thing they learn from the story.
Right. Well, maybe it's to show you also that that's like, first of all, that you should be flexible, And that, like, it's up to you to judge also if how hard did you try to get wine
Exactly.
or not. Because it
Exactly.
can tell you, like, do it or don't do it.
Exactly.
Because
Exactly.
it shows you we
Exactly.
didn't eat the whole night and then waited until the morning, and then
That's
the
correct.
next year, because he learned, he understood that. I think especially when you're a guest somewhere,
Yeah.
you
So
don't know what to expect when
Right.
you're there. So the first
Yeah.
time you could like not do something or whatever, but usually the second time around you're like, well, this is how they do it here. This is how I need to do it also.
yeah, yeah, that's interesting. And actually, Ashbam addresses our question why the permissibility of using beer is not in the list, and says otherwise. He says two things. First of all, maybe the lessons they're learning is only with regard to the order of Havdalah, rather than what kind of beverage to take from Havdalah. Now, why would that be in the list and not the other thing? I don't know, but that's what he says. Another option he says is it's obvious that if there's no wine, better make Havdalah on beer than not make Havdalah at all, which is why they didn't put it on the list. Again, neither of those two answers seem fully satisfactory. Obviously, I'm not on the level of Rashbam to disagree, but even if we were to take Rashbam's position that it's not on the list because that's not what they want to address, or it's not on the list because, hey, it's obvious if there's no wine in town, you could use beer. Nonetheless, that itself is derived that if there's no wine in town, you can use beer, and that you have to work hard, right? It's that there's still what to be derived.
What does it mean there is no wine? That's the big issue.
That's the big issue, exactly.
What does it mean?
That's correct.
It means like there's no wine.
That's right. And like you were suggesting, and like you pointed out correctly, they must have made a Kiddush also earlier. Right. So although Rashbam says this, it would seem that the lack of it being stated as part of the list is because of its ambiguity, and that it's a subtlety and it's a nuance.
But it's also not very obvious. Like usually you don't just replace things. If you're missing something to do a mitzvah or whatever, usually you just can't do it, no?
That's also a good point. You're also making a good point. Rashbam is saying it's so obvious that if you have no wine, better to do it on beer than nothing. Why?
It's like
if you don't
have to fill in,
if you don't have to exactly
shirt, then...
yeah, you're absolutely right. If Havdalah is wine exclusively, then why would I think that you can use something else? Why that's so obvious? Good point. Very good question on Rashbam. And I'm sure that there are commentaries that discuss this Rashbam. And I don't think I see anything from Rashi here. I don't see anything from Rashi. Anyway.
Maybe it's obvious after the story. He showed us he didn't do it for a whole year, but then he did. So there's absolutely no wine. You do it on the phone. Right.
So obviously we are deriving something. It's not so obvious that we're not putting on a list. We are deriving something. If anything, the fact that you're not allowed to eat before you make Havdalah is something we learned already earlier. The fact that if you make Havdalah in Arvit and you have to do it again is also something we learned earlier. All these three things we actually learned earlier. Maybe we didn't have precedent for them, but we learned them from texts.
Yeah.
So if anything, these are the obvious ones. Maybe it's not obvious because there are countering opinions to each of these. Are there countering opinions to each of these? No, I think everybody agrees you're not allowed to eat before Havdalah. I'm not sure. We have to figure it out why Rashbam takes these three things as not obvious and therefore have to be listed, whereas the fact that you're allowed to use beer, yes, is obvious and therefore not to be listed. As to your point, it seems like it's not so obvious. So definitely this Rashbam requires further investigation to fully understand it. Again, I'm sure there's commentaries that discuss it. Okay, now for Kiddush, let's do a little bit more. Rav Huna inquired of Rav Chizda, Ma'u l'kdushia shikra. Is it permissible to make Kiddush on beer? Omar, so Rav Chizda responded, look, Hashda now, considering the fact, Uma, considering the fact that with regard to Prizuma, Te'ini, Vasini, three kinds of beer. One is barley beer, one is date beer, another one is tutins, like maybe a berry, some sort of berry beer. So Rashbam says it's a beer that you make from a fruit that comes from the sneh, like tutin. Tut is usually a strawberry, right?
Tut is strawberry.
Yeah. Now all these and te'enim is figs. All of these fig, I guess strawberry and barley, are better beer than the local beer that they had in Bavel, which is made out of dates. which apparently was in abundance there. I guess there are palm trees a lot in Babylonia, and there's a lot of dates there, and that was like the cheap beverage. Everybody used date beer. Apparently, that was like ubiquitous.
Again,
Locally in Babylonia, that's right. And apparently, wine is harder to produce there, right? Israel is known for its wine and oil. Babylonia is more popular on the date side. So that was the popular drink there with date beer.
They mentioned tooth. That's what you said.
Rashbam says you can look on the right side of the Rashbam there.
Okay.
Going tutin.
I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but maybe because they're so hard to kosher.
I look up Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation. He translates it as, I'm looking up on my screen here. He says, barley, fig, and berries. Yeah, berries, Kate. All right. Anyway, so those beers are better than the local beer we have here, which is the date beer. That's just everybody has that because date is available in plenty. So says Rav Chizda to Rav Huna, when it comes to these three things, which is better beer, the boy Merav, I Rav Chizda asked Rav, the Rav Merav Chia, and Rav asked Rav Chia, the Rav Chia Merabi, and Rav Chia asked Rabbi. That goes back to Israel. So the three, we are all in Babylonia, but Rav Chia learned from Rabbi in Israel. And he asked him, and he couldn't give him the answer about making Kiddush on these three more expensive beers. Now, Shikr Mabayi, now you're asking whether I can make Kiddush on the ordinary beer that we have here. Certainly you can't. In other words, even when it comes to beer, like we were talking about earlier before, it's got to be a choice beer. When it comes to these fancier beers, I asked the question, I didn't get an answer. With respect to Kiddush, not Havdalah yet, with respect to Kiddush. And you're asking about this cheap beer? For sure you can't make Kiddush on this cheap beer. Okay, so that was
logical
reasoning. So again, pointing to the ambiguity. Because let's see how we're going to bring it back to Havdalah in a minute. Okay, so this is what Rav Chizda told Rav Huna. You're asking me about the cheap beer we have. I didn't get a straight answer when it comes to the more expensive beers. So I'm not even going to put this cheaper beer on the table for Kiddush.
Right, for Kiddush.
So Sover Minei, Rav Huna derived thought, considering what you just told. Kedusha, making Kiddush, that you cannot make a Kiddush on a cheaper beer, Aluya on this cheaper beer. Avalav Avduli, but to make Havdalah Mavdalinon, you could. That's what he said. He said, okay, you're rejecting my suggestion that maybe this cheap beer should be used for Kiddush, but Havdalah, we can do it.
Maybe
now,
it's Havdalah on the premium beer.
Oh, why would everyone be saying that?
Because there's too many steps involved here, too many
that's
levels.
Right. So why would I don't see this spelled out, but presumably, why would everyone assume that by Havdalah you could get away with the cheaper beer? Because I know when it comes to Havdalah, I could use the more expensive beer. If wine is not available, let's just assume. But I could use the more expensive one. Right? So Amar Lahu, so Rav Chizda said to him, no. This is what Rav told me. Just like you can't make Kiddush in a cheaper beer, you cannot make Havdalah on a cheaper beer.
Yeah, it's not really a good proof.
That's right.
It may be a proof to use the premium beer.
Sorry?
It may be a good proof.
That's correct. So maybe you use the premium beers. That's right. Really, but the cheaper beer that everybody uses here in Bavel, where apparently it was like rampant. We're going to see stories in the Sunnah in a moment, right, where beer consumption was rampant in Bavel, apparently.
It's like in there's some places I think in Europe or whatever where beer or even cheap wine is like the price of water. Yes,
because in a lot of ancient cultures it was like that because water could be contaminated, but beer and wine, which are fermented, then any bacteria will have been killed off. Right. So actually, people used to drink
as like
before
water.
Filter and before I guess maybe you could have boiled water, I suppose, and then cool it down.
It's expensive.
But that itself is expensive, boiling water. You have to have fuel that you can burn easily. So beer and wine was actually sometimes drunk more than water.
Yeah, but
soldiers especially, by the way. Soldiers used to have flasks with wine. The Gemara makes reference to a few times the Gemara makes reference to this idea of in many halachas comes up actually, to this like pouch that shepherds used to go around with, made of leather, keep their wine in.
But then wouldn't
like a bota, like in Spain.
Yeah, like these leather pouches that they use.
Like a stomach of an animal.
It's correct. Yeah.
But wouldn't that make water the choice drink?
Okay, so water you can't do because that's right, because it's not so well, it's first of all it's common, but also because water It's too plain. That's the right word. Too plain.
It sounds like this date beer was also cheap.
And it was too cheap. The Gemara is going to say soon. We're going to make references to the fact that it was cheap. It was like the
Is there any possibility
it was the
that,
drink of the common folk. It was nothing special.
is there any possibility that the rabbi back in Israel didn't answer because he couldn't answer what is considered a choice drink if he's not
Okay,
there?
so when it comes to Kiddush, it's different because when it comes to Kiddush, we don't have the same leniency as Havdalah to just use the choice drink of the region. So Kiddush is is more strict on the wine. Okay, let's conclude. Itmar Nami, we also learned similar statement. Omar Rav Tachlifa bar Abdimi, Omar Shmuel. Till now, Rab has been telling us that you cannot make Havdalah or Kiddush on this cheap beer. Now we're learning from Rav Tachlifa, who said Omar Shmuel, the name of Shmuel, Rav and Shmuel being contemporaries, who also said Kashem Shem Mekachin Alav, just like you can't make Havdalah on this cheap beer, Kachem Abdullah Alav, so too one cannot make Havdalah on this cheap beer.
You mean because you can't make Kiddush?
Just like you can't make Kiddush, you also can't make Havdalah. Okay, we're gonna have. Okay, we'll stop here, and then tomorrow. Okay, we have two more lines to do this, and then tomorrow we can get to the halacha. Let's finish this few lines before we get to that. Okay, because it's not done yet. Levi shadal Rabbi. Levi sent a message to, I guess, Rabbi or Rav. Which one is it? There's a resh with a. Sorry, no, that's the name is there. No, that's not the name. Sorry, no, it's not. Yeah, to Rabbi. Yeah, Levi shadal Rabbi. Levi sent a message to Rabbi. Shikra, a beer, bar tlesi megani, which has been like soaked in dates.
Beer that's been
A water that's been soaked in dates to get the flavor of beer 13 times. Means 13 batches of dates have been put in there.
being distilled or something.
Yeah. And Tleisa Magni and Taima have a Bosin Tuva. Its flavor was exceedingly, Bosin is like flavorful, very delicious beer. So now, even though it's made of dates, which is a cheaper one,
Almost like a whiskey.
but it's been distilled so beautifully 13 times. It's amazing. So Omar, and he said, this kind of drink, yeah, you can make Kiddush on that one. You can say all the praises of God in the world on this. It's so great. You can sing all of God's praises on this beer.
This is for Kiddush.
Kiddush even, which means there is a threshold, at least according to this opinion, there is a threshold in which non-wine becomes good enough for Kiddush too.
That's day Kiddush, as we learned. No.
It's a cheaper beer. It's a cheaper product because it's the date, but because of its process.
Yeah.
So now we have two things that can make beer expensive: the type of beer, but that wasn't good enough for Kiddush. But then if the process was such that it made it so amazing, even if the material is cheaper material, it made it good enough even for Kiddush, at least according to this opinion.
But in today's world,
it's very tricky to translate this in today's day and age. It's right, especially since wine is always available to us, at least in
let's say it's not available.
Jewish communities.
But you could just buy, let's say, a beer that's been processed 13 times, aged 14
Yeah.
years.
I would, for
But you
Kiddush,
just walk into the store and you buy
I would
it.
suggest using bread.
I think
Better use your challah for Kiddush than that.
I think we learn out of this that
Because challah is definitely equal with the beer, at least with wine itself, according to many opinions, certainly.
I think we learn out of this is how some people use
That's right. This
is like
this would be
not really beer.
That's right. This would be an opening
Scotch.
for the idea of using Scotch for Kiddush. That's right. It's that good. It's aged for years, such a long process, so expensive, and so on.
Right, but you didn't put any work into it.
I didn't, but I paid someone to do the work, right? When I buy the bottle, I'm paying someone to do the work.
But if you compare, let's say, so there was that, or back then, let's say
The guy did it himself.
No, but even just a date beer, which is the simple thing. But if you had to walk 40 minutes to go get it,
Or your neighbor distills it. I don't know. Who knows?
Doesn't sound like it's beer here anymore.
It sounds yeah.
Liquor.
And to your point that it's not beer anymore, let's see the rest of the story. So he says like this: Delilah at night, after drinking this delicious beer. Saturday, he was in a lot of pain.
Huh.
The hangover. Omar, he said, Misron umafayis. It's simultaneously, on one hand, it's painful, on one hand, it's delicious. It's soothing. Mafayis means like it appeases.
Liquor.
On the one hand, it's fantastic. On the other hand, not so much. Sounds familiar. Okay. Now, so having brought up this idea of drinking beer and alcohol and the problems that it brings along, the Gemara makes a few comments and we'll close out with that. Amar Rav Yosef said, I'm making a public vow. Public vow is a kind of vow that cannot be broken because you're doing it in public and it's almost as if like the public is holding you accountable. And therefore he said, I'm making a public vow to loy ishti shikra. I'm never drinking beer. I'm not doing it. It's just too harsh on the body. Actually, so I translated the Gemara as simultaneously it brings praise, it brings it's good and it's bad simultaneously. Rashbam puts it as a question mark. Something which simultaneously brings you pain is going to be the same thing that you're going to sing songs to Hashem to. Can't use that. So at the end, it seems like at the end, according to Rashbam at least, he's rejecting that you can use this for Kiddush. Because at the end, it put me to such pain that you can't use it for Kiddush. That's the way Rashbam learns this Gemara. Anyway, so Rav Yosef made his vow in public, which cannot be undone because it's again the public. It's like contingent on the public's allowing him to remove the vow, and therefore it can never be removed. That is, I'm not drinking beer ever. Amar Rava says, "Ishti mezurin v'lo ishti shikra." I'd rather use water. I'd rather drink water that was used to soak flax in. When they prepare flax to make it into,
isn't that very hard?
It's disgusting. They would soak flax in this water in order to help it process to make it material. And he said, I'd rather drink that water than drink beer. That's how bad he thinks beer is.
The beer he's referring to though now is the 13.
It seems no. Well, the beer that Levi was that the first story was referring to, where he got pain at night, is that fancy beer.
Because that's the only thing that was.
First he said, that's right. So first he said the fancy beer is good for Kiddush. That night he was in so much pain, at least the way Rabbi learns it, is that he says that kind of pain can't be used for Kiddush. Reject that.
So when he says now he's not drinking it ever again, he's talking
now someone else. Rabbi Yosef is saying,
that's just beer in general.
Yeah, it seems like it's beer in general. Rabbi Yosef says, in general, I'm not doing beer. I'm not drinking beer. Rava says, I'd rather drink this flax water than beer. Rava further said, Tihevi shikuse shikra man de makadesh ashikra. One who uses beer for Kiddush, let beer become his common drink. I guess because beer, this is the way it's explained there, is because beer was the common folk drink, was a cheap drink, and if you had beer as your regular drink, it's because you were poor. So Rava is saying, the guy who makes Kiddush on beer, let him be cursed that he's so poor that beer becomes his regular drink, instead of spending a couple extra bucks to make Kiddush on wine. He's drinking cheap beer for Kiddush, that's going to become his common drink as kind of like a punishment, so to speak.
But he must also be talking about the liquor, because if not, why mention it at all? You wouldn't be doing Kiddush on the beer anyways. He's
saying you shouldn't. And someone who violates the halacha and makes Kiddush on beer, he should be cursed that beer becomes his common drink.
I guess so.
Basically loses wealth.
Right. So there's 2 points. On the cheap, on the regular common beer, don't make Kiddush on it because it's
too cheap.
Too cheap. And don't make it on the expensive
one, because it's going to destroy your stomach.
Because it makes you feel bad.
Makes you feel bad, and that can't
make a Kiddush on something that makes.
That's what it seems like. That's correct.
Both.
Yeah, but final comment. That's right. Rav Ashkeche Rav Huna, the Kodesh Ashikar. Rav found that Rav Huna was making Kiddush on beer. Amar Le, he said to him, Shoreli Abe lemikne istir mishikra. My Abba allowed me. Abba is Rav's first name. So Rav, you, the one who's speaking to him, should allow me. Sorry, Rav started making Kiddush on beer because he got into the business of beer and therefore became his favorite drink. And thus, for him, it was okay to make Kiddush on beer.
That's an interesting.
So Rabbi is telling Rav Huna, when he saw him making Kiddush on beer, that Abba, as in myself, Rab's first name is Abba, I make Kiddush on beer because for me it's my choice drink, considering I'm in the business of beer. So there is a leniency here. So again, the Gemara keeps going back and forth between like, that's right. So it all points to the same thing, that it's a very nuanced, subjective halacha. To what degree is this like the greatest thing societally in your personal experience? Do you have bad hangovers? How well is it distilled? Is it common, less common? All these things have to be taken into consideration, which we'll look at the Shulchan Aruch tomorrow, and we'll get better clarity on that.
This added a new dimension, because before it was what was the custom of the region here.
That's right.
Personal.
So there's the region,
but not for everyone else. Is it okay?
That's right. There's the region. There's how good it tastes. There's the effect it has on your body. There's whether you enjoy it or not. There's all kinds of these details. It seems subjective. When it comes to Havdalah, we're more on the spectrum of subjective. We're lower on the spectrum. We're lower on the spectrum, and allowing you to use fancier beer, let's say. Whereas Kiddush, we're higher on the spectrum, where we cut out the barley beer and the date beer, which is supposedly the more expensive beer.
Where does kosher grape juice fall in all this?
Kosher grape juice, halachically, it's closer to wine than it is to beer, because then you make a guff on it. After wine, grape juice before beer, yes. Grape juice before beer, certainly.
I think grape juice is halachically acceptable.
Say again?
I think for everyone.
Grape juice is halachically acceptable for Kiddush.
Grape juice, yeah.
I'm pretty sure it says it on the bottle.
There's still some more.
There's
Still a few more lines in the
Sorry.
Gemara, which we'll do tomorrow. A few more lines on the discussion before we get to the Shulchan Aruch. But we're going to finish these lines, and that's going to be the end of our discussion of Kiddush. We're going to go back to our original discussion, which was about not eating on Pesach in the afternoon.
Oh, wow.
We're finally getting back to it. But before we get to the back to that, we're going to look at the Shulchan Aruch. 2 chapters in the Shulchan Aruch, 271, 272, which is one is the laws of Kiddush, which you kept coming back to, and the other one is the laws of the wine used over Kiddush, and that's where it discusses the question of using beer or other things. So we'll yes, we are going to do that. That's right. Okay, have a wonderful day, Eden.
Thank you.